Close your eyes and imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where the sun itself is a living God watching your every move, where your entire existence, from the bread you eat to the way you're buried, is dictated by forces you can see carved into stone but can never fully control, where the river that gives you life can also sweep everything away in a single flood, and where your Pharaoh isn't just a king. He's the living bridge between you and eternity itself. This isn't fantasy. For 3,000 years, this was reality for millions of people, and what they built, how they lived, and what they believed was so profound that we're still excavating their world from the sand today, trying to understand a civilization that seemed to have mastered something we've lost. This is ancient Egypt. Not the Egypt of golden treasures in museum cases, not the Egypt of movie myths and crumbling pyramids in the desert. This is the Egypt of real people: farmers, bakers, soldiers, scribes, priestesses, and slaves. The Egypt that woke up every morning to the sound of the Nile, worked under a relentless sun, prayed to gods with animal heads, and went to bed knowing that everything they did mattered for eternity. To understand their daily life, we must first understand the thing that made Egypt possible in the first place. Without it, there is no civilization, no pharaohs, no pyramids. There is only desert. We're talking about the Nile River, the river of life. Stand on the banks of the Nile in 1250 BCE and look around. To your east and west, as far as the eye can see, stretches the Red Land, the Deshret, an endless, hostile sea of sand and rock where nothing grows and nothing lives. It's called the land of chaos, the realm of Seth, the god of disorder. But directly beneath your feet is the Black Land, the Kemet, a narrow ribbon of dark, fertile soil that runs the entire length of Egypt like a green vein of life through a body of death. This contrast wasn't poetic, it was literal. You could stand with one foot on black soil, bursting with barley, and the other on red sand where a man could die of thirst in hours. The entire Egyptian civilization existed on roughly 3% of its geographic territory. Everything else was wasteland. But the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a calendar, a highway, a god, and a promise. Every single year, with a reliability that seemed supernatural, the river would swell. Starting in July, the waters would rise, fed by monsoon rains 1,000 miles away in the Ethiopian highlands. By September, the Nile would burst its banks and flood the valley, covering the fields in a sheet of water that stretched from cliff to cliff. The ancient Egyptians didn't fear this flood. They celebrated it. They built their entire calendar around it, dividing the year into 3 seasons of 4 months each. Akayat was the inundation, when the fields drowned and farmers waited. Pare was the emergence, when the waters receded and left behind a fresh layer of mineral-rich black silt and planting could begin. Shemu was the harvest, when the crops were cut before the brutal heat of summer withered everything. This cycle had been happening since before humans walked the valley. The Egyptians believed the flood was caused by the tears of the goddess Isis, weeping for her murdered husband Osiris. In reality, it was hydrology, but the effect was the same: a guaranteed annual fertilization of the land that required no human intervention. Unlike Mesopotamia, where irrigation was backbreaking labor and salt buildup eventually poisoned the soil, the Nile did the work itself. Egypt was, quite literally, the gift of the Nile. But this gift came with a price: absolute dependence. If the flood was too low, famine. Too high, villages swept away. The man who could predict, control, or at least claim credit for the perfect flood wasn't just a leader, he was divine, the God King. The Pharaoh was not a king in the way we understand monarchy. He wasn't a powerful man, chosen by lineage or conquest. He was a living god. Specifically, he was the earthly incarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, and upon death, he would become Osiris, lord of the underworld. This wasn't metaphor or political propaganda, though it served that purpose brilliantly. This was theology made flesh. From the moment of his coronation, the pharaoh ceased to be entirely human. He wore the double crown, the white hedjet of Upper Egypt nested inside the red deshret of Lower Egypt, a physical symbol that he had unified the two lands. His every action was ritual. He couldn't simply walk, he processed. He couldn't speak casually. His words were pronouncements that carried the weight of cosmic law, or Mahat. Mahat is perhaps the most important concept to understand in Egyptian thought. It means truth, justice, order, balance, the fundamental rightness of the universe. Mahat was what kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding, and chaos at bay. The pharaoh's primary job wasn't military conquest or building monuments. It was maintaining Mahat. Every temple ritual he performed, every judgment he rendered, every enemy he defeated was an act of cosmic maintenance, preventing the universe from sliding back into the primordial chaos that existed before creation. This is why pharaonic propaganda was so extreme. You see it in the temple walls. The pharaoh depicted as a giant, smiting tiny enemies with a mace, single-handedly winning battles that actually involved thousands of soldiers. It wasn't lying. It was theological truth. The pharaoh was the channel through which divine order flowed into the world. Without him, there was no Egypt. But here's the thing. Despite this cosmic importance, the pharaoh was still flesh and blood. He had to eat, sleep, and perform endless daily rituals. His day began before dawn in the most sacred space in Egypt, the inner sanctum of the temple. The morning ritual picture. The temple of Karnak at Thebes just before sunrise. The outer courtyards are already bustling with priests, but deep inside, past columns thick as redwood trees covered floor to ceiling with hieroglyphs, lies a small, dark room. This is the Holy of Holies. Inside sits a golden shrine, and inside that shrine is a statue of Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Only the pharaoh, or the high priest acting in his name, can enter this room. The ritual is always the same. The doors are unsealed, incense is burned, the shrine is opened, and there, the statue of the god is treated exactly like a living person being woken up. The god is greeted. His clothes from yesterday are removed. His face is washed. He is anointed with sacred oils. He is dressed in fresh linen. He is offered food, bread, beer, roasted meat, vegetables, all laid out on an altar. Hymns are sung. Prayers are recited. The god is told the news of the kingdom. And then, after about an hour, the shrine is closed, sealed, and the pharaoh backs out of the room, sweeping away his footprints with a palm frond so that no trace of human presence remains. This happened every single morning in every major temple in Egypt. It wasn't optional. The Egyptians believed that if the gods were not properly fed, clothed, and honored, they would abandon Egypt. The sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, chaos would return. This is the world the common people lived in, a world where the gods were real, present, and required constant maintenance. The farmer's life. 90% of ancient Egyptians were farmers. Their lives were dictated entirely by the Nile's calendar. During Akhet, when the fields were underwater, able-bodied men were conscripted for corvée labor, state projects like building temples, pyramids, or digging canals. This wasn't slavery in the traditional sense. It was a labor tax. You worked for the pharaoh for a few months, and in return, you were fed, housed, and fulfilling your role in maintaining Mahat. When the waters receded during Pharaoh, the real work began. Egyptian farmers used a simple wooden plow pulled by cattle. The plow didn't dig deep, it just scratched the surface of the wet soil enough to make furrows. Seeds, barley, emmer wheat, flax, were scattered by hand, then trampled into the mud by herds of sheep or goats driven across the fields. Then came months of waiting, weeding, and praying. Praying that the flood had been sufficient. Praying that pests didn't devour the crops. Praying to Renenutet, the cobra goddess of the harvest, and to Osiris, lord of fertility and rebirth. By Shamu, the fields were golden. Harvest was a community event. Men cut the grain with wooden sickles embedded with flint blades. Women and children gathered the stalks into bundles. Donkeys carried the grain to threshing floors, where it was beaten or trampled by cattle to separate the kernels from the chaff. Then it was winnowed, tossed into the air so the wind carried away the lighter chaff and the heavier grain fell back down. But the harvest wasn't entirely yours. Tax collectors arrived with measuring rods and scribes with papyrus scrolls. The state took a hefty portion, often 20% or more, calculated based on the height of that year's flood, which determined expected yield. Cheat the tax out, and you'd be beaten with sticks. The famous tomb paintings showing idyllic farm scenes often include a small detail in the corner, a man being held down and whipped for underreporting his grain. What remained after taxes had to last your family until the next harvest. Grain was stored in conical silos made of mud brick. It was your wealth, your food, and your currency. Because ancient Egypt, for most of its history, didn't use money, the economy ran on barter, with grain as the baseline unit of value. Daily bread and beer. The two staples of the Egyptian diet were bread and beer, not luxuries, necessities. A worker's standard ration was 10 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of beer per day. This wasn't a punishment. This was sustenance. Egyptian bread was coarse and dense, made from emmer wheat or barley ground on stone saddle querns. The grinding process was labor-intensive and, unfortunately, left tiny fragments of stone in the flour. Examination of Egyptian mummies consistently shows teeth worn down to nubs by middle age, eaten away by the grit in their daily bread. Bread came in dozens of shapes, conical, flat, ring-shaped, and could be sweetened with honey or dates, flavored with coriander or cumin. Baking was done in clay ovens, or more commonly, in tall conical molds placed directly in the embers. Beer was equally important, but not the beer we know today. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and slightly sweet, more like liquid bread. It was made by partially baking barley loaves, crumbling them into water and letting the mixture ferment for a few days. The result was cloudy, low in alcohol, and drunk through a wooden straw to filter out the chunks. It was safer than water, provided calories, and was given to everyone, men, women, children, even as payment to workers building the pyramids. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet was surprisingly varied if you had access to the Nile or its marshes. Fish were plentiful: catfish, perch, mullet, and eaten fresh, salted, or dried. Ducks and geese were hunted in the papyrus marshes or raised domestically. Wealthier families ate beef, mutton, or pork, though meat was a luxury for most. Vegetables included onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, and lentils. Fruits like figs, dates, and pomegranates were prized. Honey was the only sweetener, and for fat, Egyptians used oils pressed from sesame seeds or the fruit of the moringa tree. Notably, absent from most diets, chicken. Chickens weren't domesticated in Egypt until the New Kingdom, and even then they were exotic curiosities. Also largely absent, drinking milk, which spoiled quickly in the heat, though cheese was made and stored. The house step inside a typical Egyptian home, and you'd find it surprisingly small, simple, and practical. Most houses were made of mud brick. Nile mud mixed with straw, shaped in wooden molds and dried in the sun. Wood was scarce and expensive, reserved for doors, roof beams, and furniture. The houses were flat-roofed, and the roof was a crucial living space. In the brutal heat of summer, families slept on the roof under the stars. During the day, it was used for drying food, storage, or simply catching a breeze. Inside, rooms were small and dim. Windows were tiny slits high on the wall, designed to let in light but keep out the sun's heat. Floors were packed earth or mud plaster. Wealthier homes might have limestone paving. Furniture was minimal. Most people sat on the floor on woven reed mats. Beds, for those who had them, were wooden frames strung with rope or leather, with a curved wooden headrest instead of a pillow. The headrest wasn't just practical. It also protected the elaborate hairstyles that wealthier Egyptians wore. Lighting was provided by oil lamps, simple clay bowls filled with oil, and a linen wick. Cooking was done outside in courtyards over open fires or in clay ovens. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. Extended families lived together. Homes often had workshops attached where trades were practiced. Pottery, weaving, carpentry. The home was not just a dwelling, it was an economic unit. Clothing and appearance. The Egyptian climate dictated fashion. It was hot. Brutally, relentlessly hot for most of the year, so clothing was minimal and made from linen, woven from flax grown in the fields. Men typically wore a simple kilt, a rectangular piece of linen wrapped around the waist and tucked in. Workers wore loincloths or nothing at all. Women wore simple sheath dresses, essentially a tube of linen held up by two straps. The fabric was often so fine it was nearly transparent, though this was a sign of wealth and skill, not immodesty. Pleating, a highly labor-intensive process, was a status symbol. Children, they wore nothing. Until puberty, Egyptian children ran naked. It was practical, economical, and completely normal. But if clothing was simple, adornment was not. Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness and beauty. Both men and women shaved their body hair, including their heads, especially among the upper classes. Wigs, made from human hair or plant fiber, were worn for formal occasions. These wigs were elaborate, time-consuming to create, and a major status symbol. Cosmetics were universal. Both men and women lined their eyes with kohl, a black powder made from galena, a lead-based mineral, ground and mixed with oil. The dramatic eye makeup we see in Egyptian art wasn't just aesthetic. It had practical purposes. It reduced glare from the brutal sun and had antibacterial properties that protected against eye infections, which were rampant. Green eyeshadow made from malachite was applied to the lids. Red ochre was used as rouge for cheeks and lips. Oils and perfumes made from lotus, myrrh, and frankincense were rubbed into the skin to protect against the drying heat. Jewelry was worn by everyone who could afford it. Gold for the rich, copper or glazed faience for the common people. Amulets were everywhere, worn for protection, the ankh for life, the scarab for rebirth, the eye of Horus for protection and healing, the scribe. If you were born a farmer's son in ancient Egypt, you would almost certainly die a farmer. Social mobility was limited, but there was one escape route, one career path that could lift you out of the fields and into the halls of power: becoming a scribe. Scribes were the literate elite. In a society where perhaps only 1% of the population could read and write, the ability to manipulate hieroglyphs was a form of magic. Scribes ran the government, managed the temples, recorded history, calculated taxes, designed buildings, and composed the hymns and stories that have survived to today. Becoming a scribe required years of training, starting as young as age 5. Students sat cross-legged on the ground for hours, copying passages onto limestone flakes or pottery shards, ostraca, using reed brushes dipped in cakes of red and black ink. They memorized thousands of hieroglyphic signs and their hieratic script equivalents, a faster, cursive form used for daily writing. The curriculum was brutal. Teachers beat students for mistakes. Ancient schoolboy graffiti survives, scratched into walls. "I hate this. My hand hurts. I want to go home." But those who persevered gained access to power. A successful scribe could rise to become a vizier, second only to the pharaoh. He could oversee expeditions to the gold mines of Nubia or the turquoise quarries of Sinai. He could design a temple that would stand for millennia. And unlike the farmer, whose body broke down from decades of labor under the sun, the scribe worked in the shade, his hands stained only with ink. Women in Egypt compared to many ancient civilizations, Egyptian women had remarkable legal and economic rights. Women could own property, initiate divorce, run businesses, and testify in court. They inherited equally with their brothers. A woman's property remained hers even after marriage. Most women's lives, however, revolved around the home and children. Motherhood was the central role. Infant and child mortality was horrific. Perhaps 50% of children died before age 5 from disease, infection, or malnutrition. Women who survived childbirth multiple times were fortunate. But some women transcended these roles. Women could be priestesses, particularly in the cults of goddesses like Hathor or Isis. A few women became pharaohs, most famously Hatshepsut, who ruled successfully for over 20 years, depicted in art with a false beard and male regalia to fit the theological role. Professional mourners were always women. At funerals, they were paid to wail, tear their clothing, throw dust on their heads, and publicly express the grief the family felt. The more dramatic the mourning, the more honor shown to the deceased. Death and the afterlife. If there's one thing that defined Egyptian culture more than anything else, it was their obsession with death, or more precisely, with avoiding it. The Egyptians didn't see death as an end. They saw it as a transition, a dangerous journey that, if navigated correctly, led to eternal life in the field of reeds, a perfect mirror of Egypt where the crops never failed, the sun always shone, and loved ones were reunited forever. But getting there required preparation. Your body had to be preserved. Your name had to be remembered. Your tomb had to be equipped. And your heart had to be pure. Mummification was the technology of immortality. The process took 70 days. The body was washed in the Nile. A hooked instrument was inserted through the nose to pull out the brain, which was discarded. The Egyptians saw no use for it. The internal organs were removed through an incision in the side, preserved in canopic jars, each protected by a different god. The heart was left in place. It would be needed for judgment. The body was then packed in natron, a natural salt, and left to dry for 40 days. Once desiccated, it was washed again, rubbed with oils and resins, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Amulets were placed between the layers. Prayers were recited. The whole process was supervised by priests wearing the jackal mask of Anubis, god of embalming. Only the wealthy could afford full mummification. The poor were buried in shallow graves in the desert, where the hot, dry sand naturally preserved the body. But preservation was only the first step. In the afterlife, the deceased would face the weighing of the heart. In the hall of Mahat, the god Anubis would place your heart on a scale. On the other side sat a feather, the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and justice. If your heart was lighter than the feather, you had lived a just life. You passed into eternity. But if your heart was heavy with sin, a monster named Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippo, devoured it. You ceased to exist. Not hell, not punishment, just oblivion. The Egyptians called it the second death, and it was their greatest fear. The end of the day. As the sun set over the Nile, painting the sky red and gold, the Egyptian day came to a close. Farmers returned from the fields. Artisans put down their tools. Scribes capped their ink. Priests sealed the temple shrines. Families gathered for the evening meal, sitting on mats in the courtyard, sharing bread, beer, onions, and perhaps a fish pulled from the river that morning. Children played in the street. Neighbors talked. The heat of the day faded. And above it all, the stars emerged, the same stars that had watched over Egypt for 3,000 years, the same stars that would continue to watch long after the last Pharaoh fell, the last temple crumbled, and the desert reclaimed what the Nile had given. The Egyptians built a civilization of stunning permanence in a world of impermanence. They believed if they did everything right, maintained Ma'at, honored the gods, preserved the body, remembered the name, they could defeat death itself. And, in a way, they were right, because here we are, thousands of years later, still speaking their names, still marveling at their works, still trying to understand how people who lived so long ago could create something so enduring. They didn't conquer death, but they did something perhaps more impressive. They made themselves unforgettable.